Fraud presentation with Mama Liz. I am Mama Liz Loadholt. Fraud. What is considered fraud? Today we're going to talk about some examples and give you examples of different things that could be considered lender fraud, mortgage fraud, a lot of things that maybe you have not thought about before as fraud. This is just to help you, give you a guideline to make sure and hopefully we all stay out of trouble. Webster defines fraud as a deliberate deception for unfair or unlawful gain. If you're ever accused, it will cost you a huge amount of money to defend yourself, even if your involvement is accidental. It can happen right here in Charleston. 5 people in Charleston were charged with real estate fraud a few years ago. Involved was a realtor, the vice president of a mortgage brokerage, a loan officer, a businessman, and an attorney. All were involved in this together. And the realtor lost their license, the mortgage people lost their license, the attorney lost his license, loan officer lost his license. So this is a scary thing. And before we get into some of the examples, let's remember the Fannie Mae guidelines for these mortgages for the third-party contributions. A seller or anybody else that might be considered a third party. For example, maybe the real estate agent. If someone's getting a 95% loan to value or higher, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae only allow 3% of the sales price towards closing for anybody contributed by anyone as a third party. If it's under 95%, then 6% of the sales price is allowed, meaning like 90%, 92%, 93%, 94%, something like that. Okay, example 1. The buyer wants to buy investment property, but he does not like the interest rate. The agent advises the buyer to say he is going to move into the property. Loan officer tells the buyer and the agent that the only way to get the loan is if it is a primary residence. So the buyer lies and says that he is going to occupy the property. The agent is aware that he is not going to occupy the property. This is potentially mortgage fraud because the mortgage company is not going to charge the same interest rate for primary residence as investment property. So if you are aware of the situation, then you are guilty and you have the liability. Example number 2. The buyer wants to buy investment property but either cannot afford or does not want the higher interest rate. So the loan officer or the agent, or maybe both, tells them that they could say it's a second home when it really is investment property. Example 3. A contract says that the seller will pay X dollars, maybe $2,000 toward closing costs and repairs. Then the agent has another paper signed that says the seller will pay $2,000 at the closing to cover new carpet. That would be in addition to what the seller's already agreed to pay. This would be considered a dual contract and it is against the law. It's fraud against the lender because the lender is only allowing, say, X dollars toward closing costs and repairs. But here the agent is having the seller sign another agreement, but the buyer is giving him $2,000 to cover putting new carpet in the house. Nothing's a problem until it's a problem. And this kind of thing could get done and go on and never become a problem. But if someone gets angry with you and reports something like this, it is mortgage fraud because the lender doesn't want that buyer to get that extra $2,000 or they would have approved it going on the HUD. Writing a contract for $200,000 is example number 4 that is signed by the buyer and the seller. Then you have the buyer and seller sign another contract for $250,000 telling the seller that the extra $50,000 will be used for improving the property. They feel they can get an appraisal for this extra $50,000. The loan officer and the buyer's agent are in on the deal with the buyer. The loan officer selects the appraiser. He promises to pay him a little extra money if he will appraise the property for $250,000. The loan officer, the real estate agent, and the buyer plan to split the money, the difference. This is pretty obvious that this is fraud against the seller and the wholesale lender. And I'm sure no one watching this would ever do this. Just another example. Example number 5. Real estate agent has a ratified contract of $250,000. The home inspection is done. The home needs $20,000 to $30,000 worth of work. Seller finally agrees to give the buyer $20,000 at closing in lieu of repairs. An addendum is signed by the buyer and seller to this effect. The lender is given a copy of the addendum. Everything's good so far. Buyer and agent together select the mortgage company. The contract with the addendum, of course, goes to the loan officer. When the loan comes back from the underwriter, it has conditions that state no more than 6% can be contributed by the seller. What do we do now? The loan officer tells the real estate agent that the contract needs to be rewritten so that the seller is only contributing $15,000. Well, of course, the buyer is very upset, and he won't agree to this because he was already planning on the $20,000. So the loan officer tells the real estate agent to have the seller sign the contract for the $15,000 and then just give the buyer $5,000 outside of closing. If the real estate agent does this, this is fraud against the wholesale lender. Of course, the loan officer has committed fraud also. Example number 6. You have a ratified contract which has the seller contributing the maximum toward closing costs. The buyer or seller tells you that the seller is giving the buyer money to cover buying a new refrigerator and replace a window. Once you have the knowledge, you have liability. And this kind of thing comes up more often than you would think. We just had one recently where the seller was needing to replace the refrigerator, and he just told our agent, who was a buyer's agent, well, I'll just give him $500 after closing so he can go buy a new refrigerator. Well, our agent had this put on the hood. The lender agreed that it could go on the hood, and so everything is cool. Here's 2 problems with not putting it on the hood and just doing it outside of closing. Number 1 is this mortgage fraud because the mortgage company will not allow it to go on the hood. Then it means they don't approve it. Second problem is the seller is not obligated, other than verbally, to pay this $500 for the refrigerator. So we can have the closing, and then the seller can say, sorry, you closed, I'm not paying you the $500. Again, remember, nothing's a problem until it's a problem. Let me remind you, if the lender says something cannot be put on the hood, you should consider this a major red flag.